Well, I'm so glad that you have decided to join us this weekend at CTC, where we're all about loving God and loving people. We find ourselves in a series these days called Miracles, and we actually wrap it up this weekend with storms. If you've missed out on any of this series, we've had 10 of them throughout the summer. You can catch up online at calvarytemple.org. Click on the media tab, and you can find them all there. We talked about raising Lazarus from the dead, the widow of Zarephath, the furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Naaman, Daniel in the lion's den, the walls of Jericho, Jesus healing the blind, the woman with the blood disorder being healed, and we wrap up last week's with Gideon and the battles, and we bookend it this weekend with storms. The reason the teaching team decided to talk about miracles throughout the summer was really for threefold. First, learning to live in a way that creates and builds faith, even for the impossible. Secondly, learning to position our lives to experience God's full plan for us, including the miraculous. And lastly, learning to find practical truth in the midst of all of life's situations. Today, I want to examine practical truth that we can find in Jesus amidst the storms of life. If you'll pull out your notes, they look something like this. Or if you have a mobile device and you have the YouVersion app, you can click on Live, look for Calvary Temple Church. You can find your notes there. Or if you're one of the hundreds of people watching online right now, you can click just to your right. There's a little tab that looks like a piece of paper with lines on it. If you click there, you can find your notes. I've titled this sermon, Storms. It's the miracle of Jesus walking on water, recorded in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John. It came on the heels of Jesus feeding the 5,000 with only 5 loaves and 2 fish. But it was this miracle, Jesus walking on water, more than any other miracle, that made the disciples believe in Jesus as the Son of God. The story unfolds on the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee sits just to the lower portion of the Jordan Valley. I myself got a stand there a year and a half ago. We visited the Sea of Galilee. We got to cross over the Sea of Galilee. If you've never had the chance to go to Israel, it is life-changing. But as I stood there on the northern shore, I look up into the hills, and within my range of view, I could see where Jesus taught the Sermon on the Mount. Somewhere in front of me, no one knows exactly who, although many will tell you, he fed the 5,000. But as I stood and looked all the way around, I could see the mountain range that surrounds the lake. It raises up to about 4,000 feet tall. The Sea of Galilee itself sits 700 feet below the Mediterranean Sea. So we have quite a difference in elevation. Just to my west, kind of northwest of where I was standing, there's a massive canyon that runs through right straight down to water's edge. One of the more noteworthy aspects of this body of water is that it's greatly susceptible to sudden and extremely violent storms. Why? Because the cold air from the mountains comes straight down those hills, and it's met by the warm, moist air on the lake. And all of a sudden, we have the perfect solution for a storm. People were susceptible to and very often caught out in freak storms with little or no warning. They didn't have the Weather Channel. They didn't have the weather app. So this created a problem sometimes there on the Sea of Galilee. This is where our miracle takes place. It's found in Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 32. If you don't have a Bible, we have plenty of them in the back in both English and in Spanish. Or if you have your mobile device, pull that out. Online, you can click on the Bible tab just to my right. In verse 22, it says, "Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he was dismissing the crowd." That was the 5,000 that they just fed. "And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat, by this time, was a long way from land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. They said, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and he began sinking. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they'd gotten into the boat, the wind stopped. And those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." There are several significant points that are happening here. And in this miracle, we really need to unpack everything that's going on. Matthew tells us that the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves and the wind that was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the surface of the lake, verses 24 through 25. Though they were only traveling a short distance, the boat had already been pushed far out to sea, about 4 miles in the violent storm. The fourth watch would have been between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. They had been rowing, straining their backs for nearly 9 hours in the wind. They were completely exhausted. Mark tells us that the disciples saw Jesus walking on the lake and they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because all they saw of him, and they were terrified. And this brings us to our first significant point of the miracle. Jesus always shows up in the storms of life. You can write it down in your notes. In life's storms, Jesus always shows up. This is reminiscent of the word of God to Isaiah. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you pass through the river, they will not sweep over you, Isaiah 43:2. The Lord may not come when we think that he should, but he always shows up in his perfect timing. Jesus always shows up. You see, often we fear difficult experiences, or what I call storms in life. Sickness, disease, maybe loss of a loved one, relational difficulties, financial hardships, only to discover that in these situations, it's when we meet Jesus face to face and he shows up. The second significant point is, in life's storms, Jesus is in control. Jesus proved himself to be in control, in command of the situation, something that only God could do. To fully unpack that statement that Jesus is in control, we have to spend a few minutes tracing the development of one of the imageries used here in this passage, the imagery of water. But it's actually found throughout the Bible. There are two basic ways. One's more predominant than the other. We're all familiar with the first way, which was what we'd expect in an arid region like the ancient Near East. Much before the modern days of irrigation, it was that water is the symbol of life. Think with me of Psalm 63. My soul thirsts for you, my flesh faints for you, in a dry and weary land where there is no water. Or how about Psalms 126? Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like the streams of the Negev. However, this is actually the lesser of two ways that the imagery of water is used in the Bible. More predominantly, it is used as a symbol of that which opposes the reign of God. Think of Genesis 1:2. The earth was chaos and void, and the darkness was over the deep. And the Spirit of God hovered over top of the water. This being on top of the water isn't insignificant. It's actually a symbol of conflict and dominance. Now, fast forward with me to the flood of Noah. You have there a growing sin of the world met by this massive flood. Yet in saving Noah and his family, God shows his dominance over the mighty powers of water. The theme continues. Track with me to Egypt and God setting his people free, his chosen people free from Pharaoh. Scholars often note that the 10 plagues that God sent to the Egyptians were really a form of theological warfare. Why? It's because the frogs, the blood, the lice, the boils, the darkness, etc. took place, and God of Israel was systematically breaking down the gods of the Egyptians. Think about their greatest god, the god of Ra, the sun god. God blackens out their god and says, hey, I'm God, free my people. But really, God displays his dominance with one final miracle. And what's that great act, that last great crescendo in the salvation of his people? It was parting of the Red Sea. God displayed his dominance over water yet again. And this, for the ancient imagination, was that last straw of proving his ultimate power. You see, in the ancient Near East, people feared the sea. They looked at it as a force that opposed their gods. All throughout mythology and other doctrines, you see a fear of the sea. The ancient religion of Canaan, which surrounded the Israelites, had a pantheon of gods. The two most important gods were Yam, the god of the sea, and El, the god of their heaven. And in Canaanite mythology, each year there was an epic battle between Yam and El would ultimately be victorious over Yam. This has caused scholars to often note that some of the biblical texts read very much like polemics. What's a polemic? It comes from the root word war, or to war against. You see, some of the texts in the Bible, although very interesting to us today for a variety of reasons, were originally quite interesting for the way that they warred against the theology of the people surrounding the Israelites. The way that the text warred against the culture that they found themselves in. When God parted the Red Sea and stopped the waters of the Jordan River, this is the God of Israel demonstrating his power over the forces of that which opposed God. The stories warring against their neighbor's theology, like saying, yo, Canaanites, you think your God's powerful? Check out what my God can do, the one true God. The stories war against their area, against their culture. The psalmists continue to riff off this idea when they wrote in Psalm 29, the Lord sits over the flood. Psalms 93, the flood has lifted up. O Lord, the flood has lifted up their voices. The flood has lifted up their roaring. But mightier than the thunder of the mighty waters, mightier than the waves of the sea, the Lord is mightier. So we constantly see God above water, God power over water. I could go on, but the point is that biblical poetry commonly uses the imagery of raging waters to represent or depict our struggles, our suffering, our battle with sin. You can fill it in your notes. Raging water represents our struggles, our suffering, our battle with sin. And in doing so, on a larger level, it's a symbol of that which opposes God. And ultimately, God conquers it. Interesting note that later on in the New Testament, after Jesus dies and resurrects, the early church does something interesting that bears on our water theme. We continue it just as early believers did in celebration of water baptism, what we do multiple weekends a year here at CTC. It, of course, has roots in the Jewish practice of ritual bathing or purifying, but it takes on a new meaning for Christians. It represents dying and being reborn, dying to sin and the old way of life and being resurrected into love and into hope. And focus here on the symbolism of water baptism. What precisely do we emerge from into our new way of life? We emerge from the water, the struggle, the chaos, sin. We come up from the water, leaving behind us our former ways. Bring it back to our current miracle, and symbolically, the storm, the wind, the waves, the rough waters depict our struggle, our suffering, our battle with sin. Now back to the polemics or warring theology against the culture. The ancient Near East was a pretty brutal place. You see, one of the most brutal people were the Assyrians. They were to the north of Israel and feared enemies. In Isaiah 14, it says, I will break the Assyrians in my land, and on my mountain I will trample them underfoot. So what exactly is this trampling underfoot analogy that they're using? Well, you see, the Assyrians, when they would capture a town, they would gather all the survivors out. And then they would take all the leaders, the royal families, the judges, the business leaders, and they'd pull them out in front of all their people and they'd lay them down in a row. And if the king of Assyria was feeling good that day, he would just walk over top of them, showing his kingly dominance, showing his control over, showing that he was on top and that he had them under his feet. If he was feeling bad that day, he would have them run over with spiked chariots. In fact, it would crush the people underneath those wheels. And so we get this underfoot analogy, or walking on shows kingly dominance, command, control over. With this in mind, let's fast forward back to the New Testament, to our current miracle, walking on water, control over the sea. You see, both when Jesus calms the storm in Matthew 8 and when Jesus walks on water, he's speaking powerfully to the Jewish culture. He's saying, hey, I have complete control over the storm. By calming the storm earlier in the New Testament, Jesus isn't doing a cool parlor trick. He's acting as an ancient Near Eastern God, controlling and subduing the waters. But even more than that, in line with the Old Testament writings, he's showing his dominance over those things opposed to God. He's showing dominance over chaos, over evil, over suffering. But remember too, when he walks on water, why? It's to show his kingly domination. Jesus does to the sea what the Assyrians did to the Israelites. This miracle speaks straight to their culture in a form that they would have understood in that day. The first readers would have been like, oh my God, oh my God. By walking on water, Jesus reveals his truth to his disciples who recognized it. They recognized his divinity. They recognized and responded with a confession of faith as Jesus as God. The winds died down, and then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God, verses 32 and 33. This was the very first time that the disciples worshiped Jesus as the Son of God. You can fill it in your notes. The first time the disciples worshiped Jesus as the Son of God. A statement that in fact built on what they'd earlier said in Matthew chapter 8, verse 27. Jesus had just calmed the storm when they'd awoken him. And they said, what kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. But here in Mark, they answer their very own question. And after Jesus walks into the boat with them, they all say, truly you are the Son of God. Now that's what true worship is. Worship is acknowledging who God is and praising him for who he is and what he has done. That's why we worship God today. We worship him for who he is and what he has done. Why did Jesus walk on the water? To show his kingly dominance over chaos, over evil, and over suffering. One of the questions I ask myself is, why didn't the disciples recognize Jesus? I mean, here's one of their boys. They've been hanging out with Jesus for a long time now, and they didn't recognize him. The answer is, they weren't looking for him. Had they been waiting by faith, they would have known him instantly. Instead, they jumped to the false conclusion that his appearance was a ghost. My last point is, we need to keep our eyes on Jesus in the storm. We need to keep our eyes focused on him. Verse 28 says, and Peter answered him, Lord, if it's you, command me to come out to you on the water. And he said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and he walked on the water and came to Jesus. Peter has been highly criticized for this. A lot of people would say Peter should have never asked to get out of the boat. Well, I actually rather admire the man. You see, all too often, you and I are satisfied with little things from God. We would rather sit in the boat like the others, but notice Jesus doesn't rebuke Peter. He invites him out with him. A lot of people would say that Peter failed to walk on water, but that's not what the text says. It says that Peter walked on water to go to Jesus. This is not failure. Peter asked a tremendous thing from God. No wonder why God would use him in such a wonderful way in the days ahead. No wonder why Peter would be the one that would deliver the sermon on the day of Pentecost in days ahead. Verse 30 says, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid and he began to sink. He cried out, Lord, save me. Peter's problem was he took his eyes off of Jesus. He got consumed when he looked at the waves and the wind that were coming against him. You see, fear and faith can't both be present in the same heart at the same time. One of them is going to dominate the situation. No matter what the situation, we're going to choose faith or we're going to choose fear. Which one are you going to choose? Peter walks out in faith, takes his eyes off Jesus, and all of a sudden fear comes in. You see, fear frequently blinds the eyes to the presence of Jesus in our storm. William Carey said it best, expect great things of God, and then attempt great things for God. Peter certainly did that. You and I are in a world today that when we see the waves crashing in our storms, when we see the wind blowing like sickness, disease, relational difficulties, financial hardships, loss of jobs, this is the time when we need to keep our eyes on Jesus or we'll sink just like Peter. Peter took his eyes off of Jesus while he was walking on the water. He began to sink. This is where he prays the shortest prayer in the Bible. Lord, save me. I'm afraid that if Peter had prayed like most pastors today, dear Lord on high, all-powerful, sufficient name, omnipresent, omnipotent, in the name of Jesus, Peter would have been 29 feet under the water. Instead, when Peter was in the middle of a storm, when he let the waves take over, he cried out and said, Lord, save me. And that's the way that you and I need to pray in the middle of our storms. Lord, save me. Peter got right down to business. And that's just what you and I need to do in our storms. Verse 31, Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" You know what I love in this passage is that when Peter cries out, it says Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. This story hits all too close to home for me. I know someone who is in the middle of a storm right now. And I sit back watching him demonstrate how Jesus shows up in the storm. And in the middle of their life's biggest storm, he continues to demonstrate that Jesus is in control of the situation and in control of his life. I see joy in long suffering. I see encouragement even on the darkest of his days. I have seen true peace in the middle of the storm as Pastor John Gregg battles cancer. Never hearing him complain. Instead, when I'm calling to check on him, he's saying, "Hey, Jace, you having a good day? Let me encourage you." Our lead pastor is continuing to demonstrate how to keep his eyes on Jesus throughout this storm. And I just can't believe how he's gone through 5 treatments of chemo, and yet he never complains. John would be the first to tell you, whoa. This is not a big storm. There are people all across this congregation, across this planet, that are going through much worse situations than me. This is nothing. But I am telling you today that Pastor John continues to be an inspiration to me, and I think to all of us as we watch this storm in his life.